Long before bells and prayers shaped the day, there was no shared sense of time at all. People did not agree on when a day began or ended. There were no hours, no fixed schedules, no clear rules. Time was not something you could measure. It was something you tried to feel. Most people lived by simple signs around them. They watched the sun move across the sky. When it rose, they woke. When it stood high, they worked. When it fell, they rested. Shadows stretched and shrank, and people used them as rough guides. Hunger told them when to eat. Darkness told them when to sleep. Even animals played a role. The sound of birds in the morning or the silence of night helped shape the rhythm of life. But these signs were not exact. A cloudy day could hide the sun. A long storm could blur the difference between morning and evening. In winter, days were short. In summer, they felt endless. What felt like midday in one place could be very different in another. There was no shared system to bring people together. Different groups lived in different ways. One village might rise early and rest before sunset. Another might stay active long into the night. Farmers followed the land. Hunters followed their prey. Each group moved to its own rhythm, shaped by its needs and its surroundings. There was no reason to match anyone else. This made life simple in small groups, but hard as people began to gather in larger numbers. When more people lived together, they needed some form of order. But without a shared sense of time, things became messy. Work could start late or end too soon. Meetings were missed. Tasks overlapped or were forgotten. One person's morning was another person's later. Nothing was truly in sync. Life worked, but it was not smooth. It depended on guesswork, not structure. And as the world slowly grew more connected, this lack of shared time became a problem people could no longer ignore. Because at this point, time wasn't something people agreed on. It wasn't something they could point to or measure. It was something they guessed based on what they saw and felt. And that meant no two people were ever really on the same clock. Section 2. Slowly, in a few places, something began to change. People started to bring order to the day, not by guessing, but by setting fixed moments. And in many of these places, it was religion that led the way. In ancient Egypt, large temples were built with care and purpose. They were not only places of worship, they were also tools for marking time. The sun would rise and move across the sky in a steady path. Temple walls, doors, and tall stone pillars were placed so that light would hit them. At certain moments, when the sun touched a specific spot, it signaled that it was time for a ritual. Priests watched closely. They learned to read these patterns. Over time, the day was no longer just a feeling. It was broken into clear parts, guided by the movement of the sun. In other parts of the world, a similar idea began to grow. Religious groups, especially monks, wanted their days to follow a strict order. They believed that prayer should happen at set times, not just when it felt right. So they divided the day into blocks. Each block had a purpose. 1 time to wake, 1 time to pray, 1 time to work, and 1 time to rest. These became known as fixed prayer hours. In many early Christian communities, this system grew into what is now called the canonical hours. The day was split into parts like early morning, midday, evening, and night. Each part had its own prayer. The bells or voices would call people together. Life inside these communities became steady and repeatable. But this system did not spread to everyone. It stayed within temples, monasteries, and religious centers. Outside these places, most people still lived as before, guided by the sun, the weather, and their needs. Farmers in the fields did not follow strict prayer hours. Traders on the road did not stop at set moments. So while the idea of structured time had begun, it was still limited. It worked well inside small, controlled groups, but it had not yet reached the wider world. Time was starting to take shape, but only in certain places. For the first time, the day was being divided into clear parts. Not guessed, not felt, but planned. And at the center of it all was religion, quietly building the first system that could turn time into something people could follow. Even though this new way of organizing time had begun, it did not spread easily. The system worked well in temples and quiet religious spaces, but outside those walls, life was very different. These time rules were tied to belief. If you were not part of that religion, the system meant little to you. Most people still lived in small villages or open land. Their lives depended on nature, not on fixed hours. Farmers woke when the light was strong enough to see their fields. They worked until their bodies grew tired. Hunters moved when animals moved. Traders traveled when roads were safe. Their time was shaped by need, not by a bell or a prayer. There was also a simple problem. Even if people wanted to follow a set schedule, they had no tools to measure time clearly. There were no clocks to count hours, no watches to carry. People could not say, "It is exactly this time." They could only guess. The sun helped, but it was not always reliable. Clouds, rain, and long seasons made it hard to stay exact. Because of this, even the early time systems had limits. Inside religious groups, people tried to stay in sync, but even they had to rely on sight and sound. A bell might ring too early or too late. A shadow might be misread. The system was better than guessing, but it was still not perfect. There was also a deeper reason people did not follow these new time rules. Many did not want to. Life for most people was about survival. Finding food, staying safe, caring for family. A strict schedule could feel like a burden, not a help. Being told when to stop, when to pray, or when to rest did not always fit the real world they lived in. So even though structure now existed, it stayed limited. It worked in small groups where rules could be followed closely, but it could not spread across whole regions or large populations. There was no easy way to keep everyone on the same rhythm. Time was no longer just guessed, but it still was not shared by all. It had shape, but it had not yet reached everyone. The idea was there, waiting, but without better tools and wider acceptance, it could not grow into something bigger. Section 4. Over time, something new began to happen. Time was no longer kept only inside temples or quiet religious spaces. It started to move out into the open, into streets, into towns, into daily life. For the first time, large groups of people began to hear the same signal at the same moment. Churches began to ring bells that could be heard from far away. The sound carried across fields, through narrow streets, into homes and markets. When the bell rang, people knew it meant something. It could mean it was time to pray. It could mean the day had begun. It could mean it was time to stop working. The sound became a guide, simple and clear. In other parts of the world, a different sound filled the air. The call to prayer rose from high places, strong and steady. It reached people no matter where they were. It told them when to pause, when to gather, when to turn their focus to something greater than their daily work. These signals did more than mark moments. They began to shape the flow of entire communities. People started to plan their day around these sounds. Markets opened after the morning call. Work slowed when it was time for prayer. Even rest began to follow a shared pattern. Religious leaders became more than guides of belief. Without saying it directly, they became the keepers of time. They decided when the bell would ring. They chose when the call would be made. And when they did, people listened. Slowly, towns began to move together, not perfectly, but closer than before. Instead of each person guessing, many now followed the same rhythm. Life became more connected. People met at the same time. They worked in steps that matched. The day had a shape that others could follow. But even with this change, time was still not exact. The signals depended on people. A bell could ring late. A call could come early. Weather could change how far the sound traveled. What one town heard clearly, another might miss. There were still no tools to measure each moment with precision. So while time had become more organized, it was still not perfect. It had moved from private guessing to shared signals, but it was still based on sound and human judgment. For the first time, time was becoming something controlled, not just felt. It was being set by a few and followed by many. It brought order, but it also brought a quiet shift in power. Because now if you controlled the signal, you controlled the rhythm of life itself. Then, a quiet but powerful change began to take shape. For the first time, time was no longer guided only by people. It started to be controlled by machines. In parts of medieval Europe, large mechanical clocks began to appear. These were not small tools you could carry. They were big, heavy systems made of gears, weights, and metal parts. And they were not placed in homes. They were placed high in church towers, where everyone could see or hear them. At first, these clocks were simple. They did not show time the way we know it today. Many did not even have faces or hands. But they could do one important thing. They could ring bells at regular times without needing a person to decide when. This changed everything. Before, a bell rang because someone chose the moment. Now the bell rang because the machine told it to. The sound became more steady, more predictable. Morning calls, midday. Signals, evening bells. These began to follow a pattern that did not change from day to day. People started to trust these signals more. They felt more certain. Life became more ordered. Work could begin at the same time each day. Meetings could be planned with more care. The rhythm of the town became stronger, more stable. But these early clocks were far from perfect. They could lose time or gain time without warning. Some ran too fast. Others slowed down. They needed to be fixed often. And they were very costly to build. Only large churches or rich cities could afford them. Even so, they spread slowly from one place to another. Wherever they were built, they brought the same change. Time became less about guesswork and more about system. Less about nature and more about control. And once again, religion stood at the center of it all. These clocks were placed in churches, watched by religious leaders, and used to guide daily life. The machine did the work, but the system still belonged to those who had power over it. For the first time, time could be repeated, not just observed. It could be set, not just followed. And as this new system grew, it began to reach beyond small groups and into larger societies. What started as a simple machine would soon shape entire cities. Because now time was no longer just shared. It was becoming something that could spread, grow, and control life on a much bigger scale. Section 6. As towns grew into cities, life became more crowded and more complex. More people lived closed together. More work had to be done each day. More goods were bought and sold. And with all this growth came a new problem. People had to move in step with each other. It was no longer enough to guess the time or follow loose signals. Work needed to start at the same moment. Markets needed to open and close on time. Workers needed to arrive together, not one by one. If one part of the system was late, everything else could fall apart. So shared time became more important than ever. The bells from churches and the steady rhythm of early clocks began to shape not just prayer, but daily work. Farmers coming into the city, traders in the market, builders at work sites, all began to follow the same signals. The day was no longer flexible. It had a fixed shape. Religion and daily life began to blend together in a new way. The same system that called people to pray also told them when to work, when to stop, and when to rest. The lines between belief and routine became harder to see. Time was no longer just spiritual. It became practical. As cities expanded, this system spread even further. New clocks were built. More bells were heard. The idea of a shared schedule moved into more parts of life. People began to plan ahead, not just react to the moment. They expected others to be on time. They depended on it. This changed how people lived. Before, a person could adjust their day based on how they felt or what they needed. Now, they had to follow a set pattern. If the bell rang, work began. If it rang, Again, work ended. The day was no longer open. It was controlled. And once the system took hold, it became hard to live without it. Trade depended on timing. Labor depended on timing. Even rest depended on timing. Everything had to fit into the same shared rhythm. At this point, time was no longer just a guide. It was a system that held everything together. And that system depended on people moving in sync, not as individuals, but as part of something larger. Because now, if time stopped working, the city itself would begin to break apart. As this system of shared time grew stronger, its effects became clear. Life began to run more smoothly. Work became more organized. People knew when to start, when to stop, and what to expect each day. This made tasks easier to plan and easier to finish. A group of workers could move as one instead of acting at different times. In growing cities, this order reduced confusion. When thousands of people lived close together, small delays could cause big problems. Without shared time, markets would open at random. Goods would arrive too early or too late. Meetings would fail. But with a clear system, people could depend on each other. They could meet